once you have your waistband slip stitched into place, should be a nice clean finish all the way around. We should have this side that's finished flush, and this side should have a little bit of an extension. See if I can get this on camera so you can see. Place tiny little slip stitches in here. Here's one of those little stitches. There's another stitch right there and right there. So I worked along that fold, and from the front side you should see barely any stitches. There's one it's catching right there. And as long as you folded this at 1 inch, most of your slip stitches should be right next to your waistline. They shouldn't be way out over here, so they're a lot less perceptible if they're right next to where your waistline attaches to your skirt. So let's look at installing the hook and eye. This is an example of what a trouser or a skirt hook and eye, or what's referred to as a hook and bar, will look like. They come in a variety of colors and finishes, sometimes silver, black, I think gold possibly in some cases. If I can get that to focus. There you go. This is the hook. You see from the side, it's a piece of bent metal, so it hooks in and slides onto this bar. Now, the orientation for each of these is that our hook, you see this flatter side here with the several holes will sew onto one side of our closure. The bar should be upside down compared to the hook. So if the hook, in this case, the prong that actually hooks right here is facing up towards me, the bar should be facing down. You can see it's got a bit of an indent to it. It raises to one side and it should slide into here and kind of click into place. You can't quite hear it, but you can feel it when you slide one into the other, and you can see the bar really seats itself right there. And if you try to hook this in the opposite direction, where this raised area is facing down, it doesn't slide in properly. The bar will get caught up against those other pieces. So orientation is important. You can see I've got the indent facing up towards me. It'll slide in properly. So try it out. Try sliding that hook and bar into place and see the orientation. See the difference depending on what side, which way you orient your bar. One way is just not going to fit in there. So keep that in mind. I'm going to use the silver finish hook and bar for my sample, for my demo. And I'm going to use red thread so you can clearly see what I'm doing, but please by all means use thread similar to the color of your fabric. So you can attach your hook and bar. This is why we have this extension here, so we have space to install hooks or bars or anything else. You can attach your hook and bar in this orientation with this little flap hanging out, but just know that the positioning for it will have to go right up against this edge over here so you don't have anything loose coming out here. I prefer to place my hook and bar in this orientation so it's a nice flush finish up my center back. The way I've installed my lap zipper is actually backwards for this waistband installation, because you can see it creates a little bit of a bump as I try to bring this side on top of the other, but such is life. I'm just going to go with it. I'm certainly not going to uninstall my waistband and re-sew my lap zipper. I don't have time for all that. But you live and you learn. I'm going to grab one of my friction pins because I want to make sure I know exactly where this is going. I recommend closing up your zipper and lapping this rightmost side over the leftmost side so it's a nice clean finish. I'm not a fan of having this little lip kind of hanging out. I like to keep that hidden underneath. So I prefer this orientation. Close up your zipper, lay this side of your waistband on top of this side of the waistband, and mark right along the edge of where that overlap of your waistband lies. So I've just marked right there on the side there. I can open up my zipper now. I want to make this very clear. I'm going to work on this side, just marking this side right now. So that's where my mark is. I know that's where the edge of my waistband is going to sit. And 1/4 of an inch from that mark towards my extension. I don't want to put anything out over here because, as you can see, when this is lapped, there's not going to be any hardware showing on this side. So from that mark, I'm going to measure 1/4 of an inch towards my extension. That's 2 small squares. And I'm going to mark that. This will give me an indication of where I'm going to place my bar for my hook and bar. And again, you'll notice that there is an indent to it. It doesn't really make sense to turn this indented side down towards our fabric. We want it to raise ever so slightly on top of our fabric. So you should see that indent kind of raise up from the fabric. So that's where our bar is going to sit. We're going to use this 1/4 inch line to center our bar right there. I'm not going to install that quite yet, but that's the orientation. I'll get it centered along that line that I placed 1/4 of an inch away from my edge and centered within the inch of our waistband. So it just barely fits in there, just shy of an inch, probably about 3/4 of an inch tall. So that mark is ready, and I could install my bar right there. Let's get some markings for our hook. Now you can imagine if this was closed like this, and here I'll take my hook and bar and place them together. When this is installed, here's the flat side of my hook. Get that. There we go. There's the flat side of my hook. Got the bar inserted in there. You can kind of imagine that the flat side of the hook will sit under here. Zip this up. I want my closure looking like this. Flat side of my hook would attach inside here, and my bar would attach inside of here. This way my hook is looping in this direction. You can kind of see it lays flat along the fabric and then hooks back to my right. So when I go to hook it, I can go from left to right and it hooks into place. So it's very important that we orient our hook properly. We don't want to orient it this way, because then we got to be coming out here and pushing. And then if something pulls this apart, the hook and bar are going to fly apart. So the flat edge of our hook, this edge here, the edge that doesn't have a little hole, this flat edge should go to our left so that we can hook this through, and our bar will be sandwiched in there. So let's get the hook in place. And as you can see from there, it's inside of here. So our bar will attach right side up here. Our hook is going to attach inside this underside of under here. This is what it looks from the outside. So right under here. So from this raw edge, not raw edge, excuse me, this finished edge, I'm going to go inside here. Here's the inside of my work. From this finished edge, I'm going to measure that same 1/4 inch inside of my waistband. Make a mark for myself. So right along this line is where I'm going to place my hook. I want to place this so that I have the hook facing up and curving away. So it should be this flat flush side laying against the fabric. And this edge of my hook should be butted right up against that 1/4 inch mark that I made. And you should see 2 sets of holes, a single hole, and 2 sets of holes here. Now I'm going to sew this into place. And again, I'm using red thread so you can see what I'm doing. Sewing these in place is pretty easy, depending on whether you've got extra, whether you've left the waistband open or anything. We haven't done that in this instance, but sometimes when you're working on certain garments, you might leave the waistband open so that you can get your thread up underneath there. We don't want any thread showing out on the right side of our garment, so we got to keep our hands underneath and use that as a gauge to make sure we're not pushing our needle too far through. I'm just going to take a stitch. I'm going to take my small stitch. I'm getting my orientation for my hook and eye, my hook, into place. I can kind of see I need to stitch in this general area. And I'm just going to make an anchor stitch in and out of my fabric with my needle. So in and out. And I'm making sure I'm not pushing all the way through to the other side. I shouldn't see my needle over there. I'm feeling to make sure I'm not pushing too hard. I'm going to pull that through and anchor my knot into my fabric. Then I'm going to place my hook, my trouser hook, in place, get an idea of where it's going to get centered, right up along that 1/4 inch line. I'm going to bring my needle up through one of these holes. There we go. It's going right through that hole. Just going straight through that hole. So now I've got my hook kind of attached with that one thread. It's going through that hole. Tuck this underneath there, tuck my knot underneath there. Now this is where it gets tricky. You have to hold your hook in place. And I'm going to put my needle in through my fabric, just outside of the hook and eye. So I've placed my needle in through my fabric, just along the side of the hook and eye, and I'm coming out through the eye of my hook and eye. So I put my needle in through here and out through here. I'm still feeling, I still have my hand underneath so I can feel that I haven't stitched through to the other side. Pull that through. And you should see one tiny little loop of thread going over the metal of that hook and that hook. Do the same thing again, put my needle in through my fabric and out through the eye, through this hole in my hook. Pull that through. And at least one more time. I like to take like 3 or 4 stitches in through my fabric, out through the hole of my hook. Pull that through. So we're just looping the thread over and over and over. So we have little loops of thread holding that hook, that eye in place, that little hole in there in place. I'll come over here. I'm actually going to kind of scoot my work. Okay, and keep that balanced. I'll go in through my fabric. So again, I'm pushing my needle in through my fabric just beside that edge of the hook of my the metal of my hook. Now I'm going to angle it ever so slightly so that I can come out of the other hole right here. So I went in here, came out over here. Make sure I pull my thread through. And now I've got my thread coming through this other hole over here. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make sure this stays level because it has a tendency to want to wobble back and forth. In through my fabric, out through my hole, about 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And all the while I'm feeling, still got my fingers underneath here, I shouldn't see any stitches on the front of my fabric. But I'm going through like folded fabric and interfacing and everything, so there's plenty of material in this particular area where I'm not likely to get my needle all the way through. So 3 stitches through that second hole, so that should be taken care of. Now I'm going to do another travel. I traveled from this hole over here to this hole here. Now I'm going to travel to the next nearest hole, which is all the way over here. I'm going to put my needle down into my fabric just beside my hook. And again, I'm going to be feeling to make sure that I'm not passing my needle through the front of my work. And I'm just going to travel in this general direction. So my needle's coming out over here. That's okay. It's a little bit off from where my eye is, but the needle is going in the right general direction. I'm going to do my best to get it as close to that eye as I can. So there's my needle. It's coming out right here. So I'm going to pull in. You can see I've traveled my needle through my fabric. It's not coming out of the front side. We're just traveling through the fabric so we can get to that next hole. And I'll do the exact same thing. Put my needle through that large hole in my hook. So now the thread is coming through that hole. There we go. And again, I'll go through my fabric. My thread wants to come down here. So I'm going to try to travel my stitches up the edge of this hole. You can see that hole is a little bit wider. Still feeling to make sure I'm not catching, I'm not stitching through to the front of my garment. And again, about 3 or 4 stitches. And as you can see, I'm trying to stagger my stitches so they kind of travel right next to each other. Again, I'll go down into my fabric, travel my needle through the waistband, making sure I'm not coming out on the front. So I went in through here, now I'm coming out over here, close to these sets of holes, and I'll do the exact same thing. Lay this flat, make sure it's still angled positioned properly. I'm just going to go straight through the hole of my hook, my trouser hook. These can be used for skirts or trousers. And again, in through the fabric, out through the hole, making sure I'm not catching it on the front. I have to send my needle down through the fabric and back up through that hole. And about 3 stitches, 3 or 4 stitches. Down through the fabric, up through the hole. One, 2, 3. Should be fine. And again, I'll go down through my fabric and come up through that second hole. And take 3 more little stitches. 1, down through the fabric, up through the hole, 2, and 3. So now I've locked down all 5 holes, still aligned to my 1/4 inch mark there. Last thing I need to do is just finish off my stitching, finish off my thread. Right around here, we're getting close to it. Of course, if this thread were matching my fabric, it'd be less noticeable. I'm just going to take a tiny little stitch in my fabric, in and out of the fabric. 1 tiny stitch, pull that through. Take another little stitch in a similar place, in and out of the fabric. Pull that through, and as that loop starts to close on my thread, stick my needle through that loop, pull it through, make a tiny little knot to anchor everything. And then again, I'm going to put my needle into my fabric, travel through my waistband in any direction, doesn't really matter. It's coming out over here now. Still haven't caught anything on the front. I'm just going to travel my needle through that waistband, pull that through, give it a, just pull it all the way through. Hold it taut, give it a little bit of a tug, and then I can snip this thread, and the rest of the thread should kind of slide back inside of the fabric. So I pull it taut, snip it, and then the tail of the thread kind of slides back underneath the fabric. So that is my hook installed. Here it is upright. So make sure when you close your zipper, you cannot see that hook. You should not be able to see that hook because it's hiding underneath here. Okay, let's get the bar installed. It's the same stitching. It's fewer holes to have to go through. The only trouble with the bar is it's really skinny. It's hard to hold on to. Put a knot in my thread, just using a single length of thread. Again, I'm going to do my best to center the bar. Here's where my waistband overlaps, and here's my 1/4 inch mark. So I'm lining that up, just centering that bar on that 1/4 inch mark, figuring out where my holes are. I'm going to start up here, and again, just kind of anchor my thread going in and out of my fabric. I'm not going through to the back, just want to anchor that knot in there. And then I'll come up through this leftmost hole on my bar. And again, make sure your bar is, when you're installing this hook and bar, make sure it's raising up and away from the fabric. It should be kind of lifting off of the fabric instead of pushing into the fabric, because there is an orientation for this bar. If I could get this, like I say, it's really hard to hold on to, these little tiny bars. Okay. Try and get that positioned as best I can, level and centered. And again, I will take 3 little stitches going in through my fabric and out through my hole without going through to the back side of the fabric. 1, 2, 2, and 3. Okay, in through the fabric, and then travel over to that other hole. It's coming out of this second hole here. And then again, 3 little stitches. One, 2, 3. Okay, and then once again I'll go down into my fabric. Got to be careful while traveling in here, it's not quite as thick, so I got to make sure that my needle isn't coming through to the other side. I'm going to, I can kind of scoot my bar out of the way and just travel my needle down towards this end where I know these other 2 holes are going to lay. Just got to be patient. There we go. Not too bad. I don't see my needle on the other side. And it's coming out right down there in that general vicinity. And once again, I'll go right up through the hole of the bar. Make sure it's centered on my line that I marked, as close as I can get it. And I'll go in through the fabric just outside. So I'm just going down into the fabric just beside my bar and then out through that hole. And 1, 2, 3 stitches. And then back down into the fabric, tilting my needle ever so slightly so I can get out through that other hole. And again, 3 little stitches down through the fabric, up through the hole, just wrapping the thread over the edge of this metal hook and bar. 1, 2, 3. There's all kinds of methods for installing these hooks and bars. Some folks will do a blanket stitch around the edge and make it look really, really pretty. I don't have time for that. I can't be bothered. I like it quick. Just get it in there. And when you're using a similar thread, and you can take more than 3 stitches. This is just proof of concept. Again, I'll take a tiny little stitch over here in my fabric. One more stitch. And as that loop comes through, stick my needle through that loop, make a little anchoring knot, and then needle into my fabric, travel in some random direction, making sure I'm not getting my needle onto the right side of the garment. It's coming out over here for some reason. That's fine. Pull it through, tug it a little bit, give it a little taut tug, snip it, and let that tail just slide back inside in between the 2 layers of fabric. So that's our bar installed. So now, if I zip up my skirt, I'm going to take my hook and my bar, slide my hook under my bar, there it goes, and then give it a little tug, should snap into place, and there we go. Tug on that, it's not going nowhere. So I'll hit this with a little bit of steam, get all that friction mark off, and I'll finish off my hem, and that is our skirt completed. Remove any tailor's tacks if you want to remove any basting stitches. Finish off your hem. Again, that'll be hand finished, either a blind catch or a flat catch stitch or uneven slip stitch or a turned and stitched hem. Zipper should be installed. Seams should be nice and pressed. You should have 2 pockets, at least 2 pockets. If you decide you want to put more than 2, that's fine. There are my inseam pockets. You can see from the inside. Here's the front pocket bags. The back with a slit. I've done a slit on mine. And once I have this hem finished, this will be nice and clean finished as well. So, that concludes the skirt construction, and it applies all that we've learned in terms of darts, closures, zippers, hand stitching, hem finishes, seam finishes, pockets, and there's more left to learn even from now.